Hello everybody and welcome to today's Lean-In session. I'm Michael Linke and on behalf of the Australian Institute of Architects, it's great to have you with me yet again on today's program. Today's session is being recorded and proudly brought to you by Built Environment Channel, one of the Institute's supporting partners. And in partnership with us here at the Institute of Architects, Built Environment Channel has pledged up to $450,000 through its Build Forward pledge, which support initiatives that benefit the built environment. BEC are offering architectural practices the opportunity to have a state-of-the-art screen installed, showcasing your design work, global inspiration, and news and views from across the architectural profession. So for every screen installed, Build Environment Channel commits a further $1,000 to its Build Forward pledge, which is a program steered by an industry advisory panel. This funds initiatives which include advocacy, new CPD programs, peer-to-peer learning, collaboration, research, and improved Find an Architect service here at the Institute, and other really fantastic initiatives. So to find out more and to inquire about a free screen in your architectural practice, then visit becnetwork.com.au. Before we go on to today's Lean program, let's just take a quick 30-second look at what BEC offers.
The Built Environment Channel is a free streaming service specifically for built environment professionals. You'll receive a dedicated screen in your office on which will broadcast industry news, your own content, and lots of design inspiration too.
Thanks very much to the Built Environment Channel for that. So today's Lean-In takes a closer look at architecture, advocacy, and public space. And today we look very much at Melbourne's Federation Square, one of the city's most loved and visited public spaces. As you know, Fed Square has recently undergone a substantial review led by the Office of the Victorian Government Architect, and with the state government now shifting responsibility of Fed Square into the creative industries portfolio, what does this really mean for Victoria's most iconic piece of architecture and our youngest heritage protected site? What are the wider implications for public space across Australia? And what can be learned from the processes of advocacy? So joining me on the program today to unpack these issues are Victorian Government Architect Jill Garner, who co-authored the review, together with Tanya Davidge and Michael Smith from public space advocacy group Citizens for Melbourne. Jill Garner took the helm of the Office of the Victorian Government Architect back in 2015, and she stepped into that role as a public advocate for architecture and design after more than 2 decades in practice. As an architect, her practice, Tanya Davidge, has received a number of industry awards for delivering very sensitive, crafted public and private work. And as a design advisor and an advocate in government, she strongly promotes the value of contextual, integrated design thinking and a very collaborative approach across design disciplines. Jill has taught both here in Melbourne at Melbourne University and at RMIT in design, in theory and contemporary history. She's one of the first graduates of the innovative practice-based Masters by Design at RMIT. And she's a past board member and examiner for the Architectural Registration Board of Victoria. She chaired the National Committee for the Venice Architectural Biennale back in 2018. And she is a life fellow of us here at the Australian Institute of Architects. Joining Jill today is Tanya Davidge, architect, artist, educator, writer, and researcher. Her practice very much focuses on the relationship of people and communities to architecture, cities, and public space. Tanya is the co-founder of the architectural research practice UPLA, which was formerly known as Open House, and through the creation of public art projects, exhibitions, and architectural events, UPLA aims to draw attention to the public spaces that we use every day and how these spaces affect and influence our lives. In addition, Tanya is the president of Citizens for Melbourne, the public space advocacy group who ran the Our City, Our Square campaign, which opposed the demolition of Federation Square's Yarra building and its replacement with that flagship Apple store. Tanya has a master's degree in advanced architectural design from Columbia University in New York, and she's currently undertaking PhD research here at Melbourne University, focusing on the development of strategies for engaging public audiences with the architecture and the cities and the public space realm. But moderating today's program is not me, it will be Michael Smith, an architect, a writer, a built environment advocate, and a co-founder of architectural practice Atelier Red and Black. Michael's practice has a very strong focus on public benefit through outreach and activism, and he's heavily engaged in the architectural community and a member of the Citizens for Melbourne public space advocacy group that ran our successful City Square campaign. Back in 2018, Michael was our guest managing editor of our autumn issue of Architect Victorian magazine, and that focused purely on the issue of Fed Square and that proposed Apple store. From 2014 to 2017, Michael also was a member of the Australian Institute of Architects National Committee for Gender Equity. He's been a mentor with our mentorship program here at the Institute, a guest design critic for the School of Architecture at Deakin University and at Monash University as well. He is the consulting architect for the Built Environment Channel and has helped to design their exciting new media platform right from the very start. And he joins me now to moderate the panel. Michael, great to have you with us and welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, Michael. Great to be here. And thanks to the Institute and the Built Environment Channel for making today's session possible. Before I begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land here in Melbourne, the Boonwurrung and Werrong Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders past, present and future. This land was never ceded. So to kick off today, I'm acutely aware that we have a national audience here today. Whilst you know, many will be familiar with the controversy and the development of Federation Square, the Federation Square story over the last few years, I think perhaps the best place to start is with you, Tanya, just to talk about I suppose how we got up to this point, in particular up to the point where the state government called the review, and then we'll once we've heard from you, we'll hear from Jill about what the review was and what it found. So Tanya.
Lovely, thank you, Michael. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging I am zooming from the land of the Yallock Willem clan. Here down in Elwood, I'd like to pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. So to give you a little bit of a framework for the review, what led up to the review? Well, 3 working days before Christmas in 2017, the state government announced that Fed Square's Yarra building would be demolished to make way for an Apple store. So what this announcement did was it cut the people and the City of Melbourne out of the decision-making process, and public outrage ensued. So 3 petitions went up on change.org opposing the proposal, and these petitions, of which we held two, accumulated over 100,000 signatures. And so the Citizens for Melbourne were formed from a group of people who'd been vocal in some way about the issue, and we're architects, we're urban heritage researchers, and we're concerned citizens. And our aim primarily is to foster a conversation about and advocate for public space in metropolitan Melbourne. But the aim of our first campaign, the Our City, Our Square campaign, was to act as a voice for and give voice to the people who opposed the Apple Store proposal. So what was the issue? We were really concerned about what an Apple Store meant for Federation Square as a public space and as a space for building community. For those of you who don't really know Fed Square that well, Fed Square is a space that's formed by an assembly of buildings, all of which have minimal signage and no advertising. And together they frame the square, they hold you in, and they form the backdrop for public activity that happens within the square. So there's no other place designated for the public that works like Fed Square. It's very different to a public park or the Botanic Gardens or a museum or the art gallery. It's absolutely unique in Melbourne's network of public spaces and buildings. And what we're seeing kind of nationally and internationally is the increasing privatisation and commercialisation of public space. And these are conversations that are going on around the globe at the moment. And so I really think it's imperative that we ask ourselves, are we okay with this? And what does this mean for our public spaces? So under the previous CEO of Fed Square, we were seeing less and less community events in our public square and more activations that cost to attend and more activations that had no cultural or social foundation. So we were seeing things like Bunnings and Uniqlo pop-ups, and there were even Crownbet pavilions in the square at one point. And the reasons for this were incredibly complex. It's not often as simple as the media or the newspapers make it out to be. So one of the things is that Fed Square was set up like a private company originally, and it was envisaged that it would pay for itself. So there's your first difficulty. There were no arts and cultural people on the board, or really at management level at the time, and Fed Square was also not in the arts and culture portfolio, not in the creative industries portfolio, as Michael mentioned before, but rather it was in the portfolio of major projects and tourism. And while without a doubt Fed Square is a tourist attraction, I would argue that its primary purpose should be to the Victorian community, to its arts and its culture. So in terms of the Apple Store proposal, in terms of the design, the proposal went through 2 iterations. The first iteration was dubbed the Pizza Hut Pagoda proposal by City of Melbourne Councillor Nick Rees. And there was a second design that followed the public outcry. However, the second proposal still had no real rapport with the existing buildings. It made little civic contribution. It didn't show a huge amount of evidence that it was informed by its context, and the upper levels of that proposal encroached upon the square over 3 metres more than the existing building. So what did the Citizens for Melbourne do? Well, we did a lot in terms of advocacy. We pretty much tried everything. Between the petitions, our email list and our social media campaign reached approximately 50,000 people. We made and facilitated public submissions to politicians at a local and a state level, and even tried to talk to politicians at a federal level as well. We gave numerous talks in many different forums. We wrote articles and provided commentary for newspapers, online publications, television and radio. We were covered by local, national and international media. We launched a poster campaign, we facilitated a flash mob, and we held a rally. And if you'd said to me at the start of the whole process that I would be chasing somebody dressed up in an apple costume around Fed Square shouting, "Juice the apple, juice, juice the apple," I probably wouldn't have believed you, but I did it. So that was interesting. We crowdfunded and sold t-shirts and totes and posters. We developed a people's plan for Fed Square in consultation with our list, and we used it as the basis for our advocacy throughout the review process, and we'll continue to use that into the next stages, whatever's happening next. And for our advocacy, we won Architeam Awards, and we recently won the Institute's Bates Smart Award for Architecture in the Media for Advocacy, and we were really proud to receive the first award ever awarded for advocacy by the Bates Smart Award, so that was very exciting. Supporting Fed Square's listing to the Victorian Heritage Register was a really key part of our campaign. It was really amazing to participate in the heritage hearings. I'd never done that before, and it was really interesting. It was brilliant to see so many people speak so passionately about Fed Square and why it deserved listing to the Heritage Register. And it's been listed, and it's one of the youngest buildings in the world to be heritage listed, if not the youngest. You might have more info on that. And the heritage listing or the heritage hearings were a real turning point in Fed Square's story. What happened is that during the heritage hearing process, Fed Square management applied for a heritage permit to demolish the Yarra building. And at that point, we facilitated over 2,300 submissions objecting to the permit. And we made a detailed submission on behalf of our association. And in total, Heritage Victoria received over 3,418 submissions, which was, I think, a record for them. And then Heritage Victoria refused to grant Fed Square management the permit to demolish the Yarra building and to replace it with an Apple store, and then Apple pulled out. And due to that, the state government announced a review of Fed Square's governance's finance, built form and purpose, which Jill will speak a little more about shortly. I'd just like to talk quickly a little bit more about advocacy. Throughout the process, we made friends and allies. Fed Square brought us together as a group and together with many other people who were also part of our fight. And it really changed the way I think about advocacy. I'd always imagined that advocacy was much more, I suppose, top down. It was about talking to ministers, et cetera, et cetera. And it really made me understand that advocacy is also grassroots, it's ground up, it's about the small things, it's about the small wins, and it's about small ways we can amplify a voice, which is really, really important. And so our campaign has shown us that Fed Square, what Fed Square means to tens of thousands of people. It demonstrates Fed Square's significance to the people of Victoria and beyond. And for me, this community significance is key to Fed Square's ongoing relevance. So Fed Square was listed for many things, of course, including its architectural excellence. But our submission to the Heritage Council emphasised its importance to the community historically, but also in a contemporary sense. And also its importance as the town square. So in fact, Fed Square was listed as a significant example of its type as a town square. So its social and its civic significance is now embedded in its heritage value going forward. And I think this is a really wonderful thing to have happened for the square. I suppose just to conclude, I'd like to talk a tad about public space. For me, public space is socially produced. It's not about its physical form, it's about the relationship of its physical form to the activity that goes on inside of it, and the people and the kind of the public debates and the public realm stuff that we talk about in terms of public space. It's kind of defined at the intersection of public and private interests and governance. And that means if we want to take part in the definition of its meaning, like what is public space in Australia, we actually have to take part in those conversations. Because if we don't fight for the public space that we want, we'll end up with public space that somebody else defines for us. So having a voice in these conversations becomes really important. And it's really wonderful to see that we've helped define what Fed Square and public space is in Australia, and the review has been a really positive process, and we're really looking forward to what happens next.
Fantastic. Okay, Jill, would you like to take us through the review process and what it found and where to from here, I guess? Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. It was a huge process, really, this review, and I guess to start with what it consisted of, we were tasked by government. Government's pretty good at saying, okay, who do we need as experts to interrogate the challenges that have been put on the table, and they basically identified 3 challenges. I think I would probably put it into 3 different buckets, if you like. The first was the issue of what is the public purpose of Fed Square, and what does the community see as its value? What do they like about it? What don't they like about it? So that issue of public purpose. And then there was the second issue of built form, which is where obviously the expertise of the Government Architect's Office comes in, that we're the experts in built form and we're the ones consulted by government about built form. So that's where we came into it. And then the third element, which was obviously the third challenge, is that issue that Tanya has mentioned, that issue of governance. And so that obviously is not what we do. We're not experts in governance. So what government did was they separated this into 2 streams, and the first stream, which was given to me to lead, was called public purpose and built form. So what we did was we worked out a method, if you like, how we could interrogate the public purpose, how we could interrogate the built form kind of aspects of this. And so that in a way was where our review was restricted to those 2 things. And then stream 2 of the review was a lot of made up of an expert group of people who know a lot more than I do about economics, governance, those sorts of processes. Interestingly, we had a lot of collaboration between, not in terms of us necessarily inputting into what the governance report looked like, but in us interrogating the design aspects of things, one of the things which I will talk about that we came up with is that issue of design governance. And I suppose that is what strictly links in with our interrogation is, how does a place that is considered valuable in design terms, how do you make sure that intelligent governance of the design as it goes forward into the future takes place? So in a way, that's where our crossover came, is that issue of design governance. So how did we do it? We basically, I mean, the issue of public purpose and built form, in a way, in my mind, are two completely different things. And again, public purpose is not our expertise. We're the Government Architects Office is a bunch of architects, landscape architects, urban designers. We know nothing really about this kind of thing apart from understanding use of public space perhaps and contributing to it. So we brought in specialist consultants to run public, community and stakeholder consultation processes. So there was really some very in-depth specialist consultant workshops of all different types took place. There was on-site questionnaires answered of people who happened to be walking through the site. There was an online platform run through Visit Victoria where people who weren't necessarily embedded in the city or weren't part of the networks of the city could engage from a distance, even regionally, even nationally, in fact. And there was input from all sorts of different types of interested parties right across Australia, I understand. So that was led by a communications and stakeholder engagement specialist, and they came out with a report that was the first piece of public-facing output that came out of this whole process. And they came up, I guess the idea behind it was to come up with an acceptable, or not an acceptable, a community-supported vision for the site. You know, like most, any project needs to be embedded in some kind of ambition that takes it into the realm of what are we aspiring to? What do we see this as? What do we really want this place and set of buildings, if you like, this campus to be going forward? And so out of that community, stakeholder and industry engagement, there were all sorts of different groups from industry tapped into as well. We came up with, or our experts came up with, a shared vision for the square, which in effect is a statement. It's a very high level statement, but everybody bought into it, and it basically accentuates the belief that this is a very important, as you know, some of those things Tanya just talked about. It's an important public asset. It's used by all sorts of different parts of the community, and the threads that were captured in those stakeholder and community engagements were embedded in that vision. Now, the next part of our process was the built form process, and this is probably where my expertise comes in, and how did we go about that? So that's the second part of this stream one, was this concept of how do we get together a set of strategies or a set of principles that might accommodate intelligent and informed change to a place that's precious and valuable. So to do that, I put together a panel of experts, and I invited a group to be part of my expert round table, if you like. And every time we got together, we interrogated what was going on, and we put together every proposition that my team internally to the OVGA put together. We ran past my panel of experts and interrogated that quite significantly as well. And we came up with a set of design principles and a set of strategies for intelligent, informed change as the square sort of heads into the future. So where we got to, someone's just turned a kettle on. And have I got something noisy in the background?
I think it's okay.
Is it okay?
I think it's fine. Yeah.
Hopefully it will boil and turn off. Sorry about that. So basically where we landed, if you like, through, and it was a year's worth of interrogation. And what my team at the OVGA did was we pulled together all of the studies, the research, the individual projects on Fed Square that had taken place over the past 15 to 20 years, basically, because there's been a lot of thinking, a lot of work, a lot of individual projects taking place on the site. So we took the opportunity to collect them into a resource, and we've now got a repository, if you like. It's like an index of all of the work that's been done on Fed Square. And the architects that have worked in the space over the last 20 years were amazing. They opened up their, they called them their dark ops rooms, and showed us the types of thinking that they had done to solve some of the utility problems that had taken place in Fed Square over the past 20 years. Lots and lots of thinking on how to solve individual issues, many of which have never happened, and some of which have happened over the years as well. So we've now got a repository of all of that research, all of that background, and all of the reports. So we're quite proud that we've got this a very important library, if you like, of thinking and research and projects embedded in Fed Square itself. So that was my step one, was try to gather the thinking together that had been done. And my panel interrogated the good things, some of the really clever and intelligent things that had come out of those projects, and we kind of kept going back to them and saying, is this a valuable thing to keep on the table going forward? So we identified what those, perhaps those visions were along the way. Then the second part of the really critical part of Federation Square becoming part of, or being listed on the Victorian Heritage Register, was the issue of a CMP. And any place or project that has become that important in its state needs to operate with really good knowledge of what's valuable about it in real terms, like real study about what's...
Jill, just to jump in there, CMP, for those who are not familiar.
Oh, for those who are not familiar with it, a conservation management plan. So when a heritage listing is engaged, an expert heritage consultant is engaged to identify the different levels of significance within that place. So while that particular project was taking place, our panel tapped into that process as well, kept tabs on what was considered highly valuable, less valuable, and the areas of least value across the whole buildings and place, because as was suggested, it's not just a building listing, it's a place listing, which makes it quite an important kind of larger scale vision, if you like. So critical to the heritage listing is that work on a CMP. And then what my panel did as we worked into that is we aimed to identify some overarching design principles, because one of the things that became very clear in our research is how much Melbourne has changed in and around Federation Square. And so what we needed was some really high level principles to allow intelligent and informed upgrade or shift or enhancement, I suppose we use the word enhancement, to take place. So we identified two overarching design principles, I guess we called them. The first of which is, so as a statement, the first principle can be announced as to remove boundaries and connect precincts. And in a way, where this comes from is that issue of the way that Melbourne has shifted so significantly, and one of the one of the difficulties or challenges associated with Fed Square is the way that it has a dotted line around the perimeter of it, and that is Fed Square. And in reality, what we tried to perhaps make very clear in our report is that Fed Square is in fact one nodal point in a network of all sorts of connections that operate within this city. So rather than see it as an isolated site with a title boundary, again, which in this case is extraordinarily complex because there's a lot of abutting titles and abutting adjacencies and ownership and governance arrangements in and around the site. But if we could dissolve those boundaries and allow us to see the site as part of Melbourne, part of the connections that exist beyond the site, that maybe that gives us a different view of how the site might work. And so every time a project is mooted on the site, whether it be as simple as changing a light fitting or a set of signage principles, how does that impact the streets around it, the connections, the river, those sorts of things? So that idea of removing boundaries and connecting the precincts works really closely in line with Melbourne's ambition of having great precincts that are connected, interconnected, and have really great relationships between them. So underneath that key heading is four, what did we call them? We called them, we had our key principles, and then key design principles, and then what we put underneath them is what we call design strategies. So underneath that header of removing boundaries and connecting precincts, we had 4 design strategies underneath those. And one of them was about processes for design change. And this is where that link in with the governance team came in, where we suggested there needed to be really clear processes for design change and an approach to design change. And how do you do that with a clear design governance arrangement? And we looked at, in fact, this is quite an interesting conversation because we looked at other places that have this kind of sensitivity attached to them, but do need to change and need to be enhanced or shift in some way. And so we in fact looked at the Opera House, and we looked at the design governance arrangement that exists in the Opera House precinct, because the Opera House was obviously listed as a 20th century heritage place, and what was done was a very clear set of design, and a design advisory approach to every project was embedded in the way that site was dealt with. So in a way, that was our model, because it highlighted the importance both of building and place. Although the significant difference with Fed Square is that it's not sitting out on a promontory. It's not an object as such. It's actually embedded in the networks of our city, which is why that removing boundaries and the connection proposition is such an important proposition to overlay it, which is a very different situation to the Opera House situation. But what we looked at was design advice and design governance and how that works and how that might be able to be embedded in the way that Fed Square goes forward. The second strategy that sits underneath that header is really every time anything is thought about with Fed Square is to connect with the precincts beyond the site. So we've got St Kilda Road, we've got the Arts Precinct down to the south, we've got Birrarung Ma and the Sporting Precinct to the east. To the west, we've got Docklands and the connection along the river towards the convention centre, etc. And to the north, we've got the Civic Spine. And so in a way, Fed Square is completely surrounded by really important connections to other precincts in Melbourne. So how do we make sure that every time any project is thought about in and around that site, that it's seen holistically as part of a spider web of really important connected projects, if you like. The third design strategy embedded under that heading is to embrace the Yarra River, and this came through loud and clear with our consultation. And the Yarra, we also looked back into the original design ambitions of the original competition winning design, and the issue of embedding the Yarra River as part of the network of connections that were linked to Fed Square came out loud and clear. So that's our third strategy embedded under the connection of precincts. So it means that any time we think about any activity at Fed Square, we think that might be one of the things we think about, how it impacts the river edge or how it enhances the river edge, how we connect to the river edge. The fourth strategy underneath that header is to embed information exchange. And once again, this was out of research going right back into the original ambition of Fed Square, which was so tied up with the idea of online connectivity. And, you know, remembering this is 20 years ago, and in fact, it was quite archaic, but the ambition was so forward thinking in terms of information exchange. So we really saw, one of the things we embedded in our discussion was Fed Square is not just a portal to Melbourne, it's a portal to Victoria. And to be a portal for Victoria means information exchange in all sorts of ways, which was very much part of the ambition of the original square, needed to be embedded in anything that we do there. So they're the four strategies that are embedded under that first header. The second header, which is the second principle, is the issue of enlivening the destination. And this in a way came out loud and clear with those that the community input varied. It was quite diverse. And one of the things that was most significant in our research is because Fed Square predated our acknowledgement of country, our awareness perhaps of our history, our Indigenous history, and some of the cultural history embedded in place, is that we supported a lot of the information that we got back from both community and stakeholders about, you know, shouldn't this be a place that as a visitor, we understand about Melbourne and Victoria's connection to its First Peoples. So that became a real driver. And the fact that we've got our Australian Gallery and also the Koori Heritage Trust on site was a real an anchor for an experience which should be much deeper than it had been. And we, you know, digging back into the history, 20 years ago, we didn't have anything like an acknowledgement of country. We have to remember how much our kind of cultural awareness has shifted in that 20 years. So that issue of celebrating First Peoples hasn't really ever been embedded quite to the extent it could have in the square. So that became one of our recommendations in enlivening the destination, was that idea that embedding First Peoples culture and a continuing connection to the land, and I'm talking Victoria, both this site and Victoria-wide, seemed to be a very important, this became important portal for that particular experience. The next, this has got four sort of strategies under it as well. The next strategy embedded under enliven the destination is to reinvigorate the public realm. And we've heard some of Tanya's concerns that the community had. There were various concerns, there's some of them, you know, there were lots and lots of interesting input from all sorts of different people of all sorts of different background, cultures, expertise, in fact, about what reinvigorating the public realm might look like. Prioritising pedestrians was our next issue, and this is very much in line with, I guess, where the Office of the Government Architect sits anyway. We are huge advocates for allowing pedestrians to lead and for allowing traffic, cars, etc., to take second place, particularly in our inner city. So the idea of prioritising pedestrians And I guess we're talking on the site and beyond the site. You know, all the time I'm talking about beyond the site as well. Like, how do we raise the status of the pedestrians in and around this site?
Oh.
And then the last strategy embedded underneath enlivening the destination reflects back onto what Lab originally proposed in their original competition winning submission. Because they, well, in fact, not just the competition, but also the realised product, was that there was a lot of design ambitions embedded in that proposal, which, you know, the tap got turned off. At some stage, the project got halted, and enough money had been spent, enough had been built, and in a way the project, we came to the conclusion as a panel that what Fed Square represents is unfinished business. And there was a whole lot of business or concepts or strategies embedded in the original scheme that didn't ever really get realised, or they got shifted in some way. And in fact, the edge of the Yarra is a very good example. You can virtually see the line that got cut across the back on the south side of Fed Square that said, this is where we stop and we don't keep going. So our kind of, the eighth design strategy embedded under that idea of enlivening the destination goes beyond the square itself sometimes. How do we enliven it as part of a much bigger picture? But how do we go back to those connection ambitions of the original scheme and potentially revisit them, maybe reintroduce them as principles that might help what the square kind of looks like going forward. So that's kind of a summary overview of where we got to, these 2 overarching design principles and these 8 design strategies that sat under the principles.
Fantastic. From this review, the government obviously has come out in support of it and has announced $20 million to be allocated to Federation Square in the sort of more immediate term as part of the COVID stimulus sort of situation. But do you have expectations or ideas around what that will go to? Is it just updating plant and equipment? Is there projects specifically in mind for that 20 million?
I can't actually answer that. I don't really know. I mean, it got announced basically a week ago. Yeah, we're so delighted that, well, I suppose there's a couple of things that have happened in the last few weeks. And one is that shift that Tanya mentioned about the, there's a different minister now responsible for the site. So that's quite a significant shift. And that presumably is, for all sorts of reasons, that came out of the governance side of things. That's not embedded in our work, but that was embedded in the Stream 2 proposition. The other thing that's happened, which was very much part of our connectivity proposition, is that there's a new pedestrian crossing. Believe it or not, this sounds so simple, but there's a pedestrian crossing that's gone in from that goes straight across, basically from Acme across to the Forum.
It was a big hit on social media. It went viral.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. So that, I mean, as a proposition, it's, to me, what, you know, when we really looked at the circulation that was taking place around Fed Square, and those that are not in Melbourne won't know this, but to actually get across the street, you had to go across 3 pedestrian crossings, way down at one end, and cross the street into Hosier Lane and into Flinders Lane, which has become Melbourne's food and beverage street, really, which once again didn't exist when Fed Square was first formed. So the connection, the pedestrian connection between Fed Square and Hosier Lane has meant over the past 10 years or so that basically people just wait till there's so much traffic that they just wind their way between the cars to get across Flinders Street. So that very simple proposition of a crossing was something that was talked about early. Vic Roads had to come on board. You know, these are cross-governmental discussions, and it doesn't quite look like what we would love it to be, a bit wider and a bit broader and a bit more scrambly than it is, but at least it's there. And that's a really significant network connection that shows, yeah, maybe a first step in the right direction of that.
Fantastic.
I must say, I'm looking forward to using that pedestrian crossing when I can go more than 5 kilometres from my house.
I know.
So touching on that, with connectivity being such a big part of what the review found as needing to be addressed, is this going to be a tool that government can use to convince those other government bodies, Vic Roads, Melbourne City Council, all of the other different government stakeholders to be able to get a more pedestrianised precinct, a broader precinct?
I'm really hoping so. And I think along the way, I mean, aside from the on-site stakeholder roundtables that we had, that huge amount of those sorts of discussions, the other thing that there's been a significant amount of is internal government discussions. So there's been discussions with, because the minute you step off Fed Square, you are in City of Melbourne territory, or you're on Yarra Trams territory, or you're on Department of Transport territory. Across the road, you suddenly hit Flinders Street Station. So I've lost count of the number of cross whole of government discussions that we've had, where there's been representatives from all of those individual groups. And now that Melbourne has also, or Victoria has a group called Precincts, that's been another really interesting shift in government, that there's now a whole body of people who are interested in what a precinct is. And they're interested in the fact that a precinct involves not just the owner of that particular land, but the kind of shared ownership, or the shared use, or the shared patterns of you know, different operating things that take place. So yes, you've got Yarra Trams, you've got Metro, you've got the roads, you've got City of Melbourne, you've got the station across the road, we've got the bollards people, which is the Victoria Police, are doing bollards everywhere. So they're there. So there's been, as I say, I've lost sight of the number of discussions. We've found government generally has been so interested in being part of the discussion. And we, you know, one of the tasks that the Government Architect's Office has is we're constantly trying to find champions in government who care about something more than just perhaps the one reason why we are putting bollards there. That's a very important reason, but who actually understand that over the top of putting a bollard in is impact, people impact, and impact on pedestrians. And so to find somebody who listens to our message and says, oh, okay, I now look at my own project through a slightly different lens, and one of the ridiculously simple things that we've managed to do is we've managed to get the bollards slightly further apart, which sounds like it's such a small win, but in fact it's a huge win, because instead of the bollards around Melbourne being placed so that only one person can walk between them, we think we can now get 2 between them, which we think is a huge difference. So that issue of putting people first and putting the pedestrian first is very much on the City of Melbourne's radar. It's not on everyone's radar, but it gives us, now that we've had buy-in, if you like, to the principles that are embedded in our review, it does allow us to keep putting them back on the table. And every time there is something that we think challenges those principles, we can go back to them as something that we might remind government that, you know, maybe we could slow the cars between when they go across Princes Bridge. Do we really need a turning lane, 2 turning lanes that go across Princes Bridge? Could we make it harder for cars those sorts of questions we feel quite capable of putting on the table now.
Sure. One of the big discussion points has always been the connection to the river. And I wondered if, I know that we're really running out of time, but very quickly, if government was to come to you and say, we've got, I don't know, let's say 50 million or whatever to really do a project that will connect Federation Square to the river, how do you see that? Would that be a competition type process, or would there be, yeah, how do you see that built environment, outcome being pursued? What do you think would be best practice, I guess? Is it a competition? Is it through a review panel? Would you have a small tender group?
That's a huge question. I can't really answer it. I mean, I'm always a huge advocate for a design-led outcome. So whatever gets you to a design-led outcome,
yeah.
And there are various ways that you can do that.
The review doesn't lock in a process at the moment?
No, I mean, basically the ambition of our review, if I go back to the Opera House model, is that there is a design advisory panel who is aware of every project that takes place within that precinct. So it means that things don't happen in isolation. And so it means that if a design advisory panel can get involved to a greater or lesser extent depending on the scale of the intervention or the seriousness of the intervention, then, changing a light bulb is something that, yeah, a design advisory panel would need to know about, but they don't need to necessarily impact unless the choice of light fitting is wrong. So that idea is what we've called design governance. So embedded somehow within any process for change is the proposition that, and the way that it's worded in New South Wales or in Sydney is that there's a group of eminent experts who are part of that panel, and they're thoroughly aware and they are consulted when something takes place. So that's really our ambition. We're talking very high level, but we're talking process rather than a particular outcome.
My feeling is that if we're going to spend $50 million to the south, it should be a public process as well. I mean, public space is, as I said before, made by and for the public. And so I think it would be really important to have them embedded in that process.
Yep, excellent. Now, I'm conscious that we've got only a few minutes left. Michael Linky, did you want to have some field some questions from the viewers?
Yeah, correct. We've got a number of questions coming in. First of all, I have my own question, and this is really directed more at Tanya and yourself, Michael, of course. But, Tanya, you talked very much about friends and allies when you were going up against Apple. Now, Apple, global organization, billions, in the bank, etc. Did you make enemies of Apple? Did your iPad suddenly stop working? I mean, did you have any sort of negative feedback from Apple? It's an honest question.
I still have my iPhone. They're big enough that they could just basically ignore us, which is the reality. But I do think there are international conversations going on at the moment that we're becoming much more aware of about what it means to be a good corporate citizen. And I think that we actually need to hold our corporations to account, and we need to say that they have values. I'm not against Apple in any way, shape or form. I was against an Apple store at Federation Square. But we really need to think about the land that they are the territory that they're trying to claim, and what it means for our cities in a really considered way. So it's really interesting to see the conversations that were happening at a similar time around the Amazon headquarters in New York City, which didn't go ahead there because people were concerned that Amazon were playing the different cities off each other for tax breaks to determine where their headquarters were. That's obviously a larger question than architecture, but it goes to being a good corporate citizen and what it means to develop public space. So I think these are really interesting and important conversations that we need to have, and we need to have together. We can't just let these conversations be determined from the top down.
There's a question.
I might also add quickly to that there was might have been a perception amongst some people about our City, Our Square campaign that we're just anti-Apple. If that were the case, we wouldn't have been participating in the next stages of Federation Square and keeping a very close eye on how that goes, particularly in terms of advocating for further funding for Federation Square so that it doesn't have to be a sort of for-profit, pay its own way kind of model. So.
This is a question probably more directed for Jill, and this is related to the review of Fed Square. And Michelle asks on the chat, look, did the review look at the use of the existing buildings? Some of them look quite tired, and it looks like some buildings may have had been neglected in some way due to a lack of maintenance or whatever. Did the review look at the existing properties, where SBS are housed and so on? Jill?
Oh, a really simple answer to that is no. Because we weren't really tasked with a maintenance lens, but part of the CMP, part of the Conservation Management Plan, obviously has gone through every building and every part of the site that has been heritage listed and has identified it into contributory, non-contributory or median. And embedded in that report is, maintenance. We talked about maintenance a lot. And, Fed Square is made out of very unique materials. It's a very unique set of structures. It's a very unique ground plane. And so the nature of maintenance is challenging. It's challenging for Fed Square generally and government generally to make sure that that it does stay at that level. Although interestingly, some of the feedback, if you really do read the stakeholder feedback, some people wanted it to be shabbier. They thought it was a little bit pristine and they didn't like it because it felt a bit policed and well kept. So it's interesting, the different positions that came to us was fascinating.
Okay, a question from Bill on the chat as well. This is again directed at you, Jill. And the question is, did the review consider a framework for the airspace which is immediately to the east of the Fed Square project?
Federation Square East?
Yes.
Well, in terms of considering it, obviously, because our strategy of connecting precincts is clearly an overarching idea that yes, we're not here to do any design propositional thinking, but of course there's a dotted line around Russell Street saying, what could we do with Russell Street? This is an area that needs really deep design thinking. And so Fed Square East is obviously another bubble leading into Birrarung Ma. There's some really important design thinking needs to be done there. And so I suppose by airspace, you say, yep, above the railway lines. It's the same situation as Fed Square, where whatever happens there, whenever it is in the future, and it will be a platform of some sort. But I was going to kind of revisit that issue of connectivity to Fed Square East and also to Birrarung Ma, because some of the feedback about so much of the community wanted Fed Square to be a garden with canopy trees and places to sit under trees. And so by explaining to the community that it can't be that it's actually over a rail line. But our discussion about connectivity really resonated, because what we were able to say is, if we could get you to Birrarung Ma really fast, or get you across the river to the gardens, or get you to Queen Victoria Gardens, or get you to Alexandra Gardens, if you could get there fast from Fed Square, you don't necessarily need that landscape in Fed Square, because you've actually got it all around you, and all you need to do is be able to get there.
Another question from the chat, and this is from Steve, who asks, he actually commends you, Jill. He says the process that's been undertaken sounds very logical, it's very appropriate in response to the challenges that were put before you as the Victorian Government Architect. His question relates to your ongoing role. So his question is, what is your ongoing role, and what role will you have as the OGVA in oversight of any future design interventions in Fed Square? Well,
I suppose part of, I've been at the OVGA for getting on for 10 years now, and I guess part of my interest in Fed Square ultimately was raised by the fact that over those 10 years, I've seen so many projects, and at one stage I counted and there was 20 individual projects taking place at Fed Square. And so that idea of coordinated shifts in what was taking place there just seemed extremely important, because it seemed to be slightly ad hoc, and some parties were consulted for some projects, other parties were consulted for other projects. That's where this idea of design governance comes in. And because it takes time potentially to set up that framework as what that actually looks like, I suppose I've put my hand up and said, at the moment, the Office of the Government Architect perhaps sits in that role. And by, you know, until we get ourselves organised into what that particular role looks like, I think we will stay very involved in the interim.
One of my final questions then to you, Jill, if that's okay. This is another question which has come through from Fred on the chat, and he says, it's great that you always encourage very much a design-led review. Given a city's strategic planning is the most influential aspect of our built environment, and it's dominated by very much a political process that is sometimes not transparent, and we know often that it can exclude architects and other design professionals. How can architects then, what's your advice for architects who may want to become involved in strategic planning of our cities and using their visual communication skills to open up the process for the public to infuse appropriate and responsible design into some of the submissions? What's your advice to architects who are wanting to get into this arena?
What a huge question. I think, I mean, what you've seen from Tanya and Michael here is that interest and engagement in a particular project has led to activism, if you want to call it that, in a particular way. And I guess that exists in every local government. It exists. I often think in the Government Architect's Office, we're kind of activists in our own way. We're obviously embedded in government processes, and we have to be very cautious. But we also find that right across government, there's all sorts of people who understand design and understand the benefit of it, and are really interested to understand why we shout so loud and long about a design-led outcome rather than maybe an engineering-led outcome or something that solves the car problem. So that doesn't really answer that question, but I guess there are all sorts of forums for those that are interested in local government, in state government. I love every time I find an architect in government, in state government, and they sit in all sorts of interesting places. And there are, as I say, there's a whole new group called precincts. I don't know how many architects are sitting in there, not many, but there's some landscape designers and landscape architects and urban designers embedded in there. So there are parts of government where architects can get in there and bring their really great lateral thinking that look at so many networks and so many different diverse propositions and wind it into the discussion.
Can I just make some comments about local government? I really discovered local government during this process. The City of Melbourne have no kind of governance over Fed Square at all, but they could clearly understand there's not much public open space within the CBD grid, and they could clearly see the precedent that putting an Apple store at Federation Square would set. And so the City of Melbourne were very, very clear on their position that they didn't want to see that happen. And I met some wonderful people in the City of Melbourne through the process, real advocates for doing things better. And local government is a really boots on the ground kind of way to actually look at changing the city. That decisions made at local government are really the decisions that are made every day that shape the city. I mean, there are obviously bigger ones at a state level, but they're more abstract. So I gained a newfound appreciation, I think, for local government, definitely.
I guess to add to that, obviously state government is that next level from that, and there's really quite a good relationship, I think, between state government and local, but not across all projects, obviously. But I do think, and state government represents, local government represents the community voice in many forums as well. So they're good networks to make. But I do think the more architects that are in state government, the better it would be, because we really do, as a profession and as a skill base, have some really valuable ways of looking at projects.
Absolutely.
I'm very conscious of time and the fact that we've gone over a little bit, but this has been a fascinating discussion. I suppose my final question to you, Michael, and to you, Tanya, really is, we've had a number of questions come in through the chat box, which is around people very keen to see the vision from citizens of Melbourne regarding Fed Square, what the design looked like. Is there anywhere they can go online to have a look at some of the submissions and some of the discussions? And
sorry, what, the Apple Store?
Yeah, so the vision that you put through and the work that you've done in terms of citizens of Melbourne.
I think, Tanya, that's regarding mainly the People's Plan. Did you want to talk about that?
I think that's on our website.
Yeah, what's the website? That's probably the best thing to do. I'm just conscious of time. If that's okay.
It's ourcity.oursquare.com.au, I think. Oh God, I've just forgotten it.
Nothing like putting you on the spot. Let's see if we can get that website confirmed. Michael, do you have any idea what it is?
But we didn't put forward any design visions for the square. We were very conscious. Our kind of, I suppose, key interests were community and process in the whole thing, and what Fed Square was and what Fed Square needed. We very much saw the Apple proposal as a symptom of a greater issue, and so now it's wonderful to have Fed Square, I suppose, reviewed in its entirety to really look at what the vision for the square is, what it should mean, what its place should be in terms of its position in the city and its broader context.
That's great, thank you. Ainsley, who is at Build Environment Channel, has very kindly put that on there. So www.ourcityyoursquare.org. Okay, so it's on the chat for you.
Our Square, Our City, Our Square.
Our City, Our Square. Sorry, I've got my contacts in today. Okay, so ourcityyoursquare.org. None of us can get it right today, I tell you what. It's been a long day and we're in Melbourne and it's lockdown. Okay, so that's really it for today. I think we'll leave it there if that's okay. We've gone slightly over. Apologies to those who needed to shoot off to other meetings, but it has been an absolutely fascinating discussion to sit back and watch this week. So thanks very much to Jill Garner, Officer of the Victorian Government Architect, Tanya Davidge, and of course, thank you to you, Michael Smith, for moderating the chat. It's been great to have you with us. And of course, thank you massively to Built Environment Channel for supporting today's Lean In and for actually securing the speakers for us on our behalf. It's been great. So if you want to find out more about Built Environment Channel, do visit becnetwork.com.au. That is it for today. Thank you very much for joining me. As always, I've been Michael Linke here at the Australian Institute of Architects. Great to have you with me. We look forward to catching up with you on Thursday for our next Lean In. So do keep an eye out for that email. That will be coming through your inbox on Thursday morning. So join me then. Until then, do stay safe. Thanks very much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much.